thanks a lot for coming. It's a beautiful sunny day, and so I appreciate you guys coming indoors to listen to me talk. Last year, I did do a talk about Colonel King, after whom Kingsville is named, and today we're going to talk about the children of Colonel King. So, to begin, we're going to review from last year. So this is a portrait of Colonel King. The original is actually at the Kingsville Military Museum. I welcome you guys to go and check it out. And this is the house that's still standing. That's Colonel King's homestead. And so to review from last year, Colonel King was born in London, England in 1805 and trained as a school teacher. He emigrated to Canada with his wife and two stepsons in 1829, settling first in Montreal. And then due to a cholera outbreak, he ended up, the Kings left and they went to Michigan, which was really populating, really encouraging new settlers to come there and giving them land in 1834. But then he decided to return to Canada the following year. So they were waylaid by snow in 1835, and James took a job as bookkeeper for the grist mill here in Gosfield, which is now Kingsville. It used to be called Gosfield. They were heading back to Montreal, but they got waylaid here because this was the closest way from Michigan on the way to Montreal, and they got snowbound. So he took the job for the winter time, and then when the spring came, he decided this is a lovely area, why don't we stay here and make this our permanent home? So in 1850, he had already been kind of farming north of town, but then he decided that closer to the lake, and there was a couple kind of crossroads that were happening already, which is our present day Four Corners, he thought that would be a great idea for a new community. So he encouraged two farmers, Harrington and Stewart, to have part of their farms divided into building lots to form this new community. So Stewart was to the left or to the west of Division Line, and Harrington was to the right. He had already built a small house near the Four Corners where the present post office is on King Street. That was where the area was, and in fact King Street was originally the driveway to his back barns and sheds. So it was never actually a road, and you'll see in this map there is no King Street, and it's just because it was at the time just his property and his driveway. So he had already built this first house in 1843, and he had got local farmers to he encouraged them to build a small school, which was across the street, actually where Red Apple is. Oh no, just south side of Beach Street, where there's the a building. There's a two-story brick building. That's the original old school lot. So that's where the first house in Kingsville was located. Perfectly convenient for Colonel King to just be across the street from the school. So he had already started the school. He already was the first person to build a house here. So he encouraged these farmers to come together, and they paid a surveyor to come and survey. So this is an 1850 survey, and this is what the original town of Kingsville looked like. And Colonel King had great vision because it was a really large survey. If you look at other communities, specifically Leamington, at their Four Corners, like the one corner was surveyed, 1 year, like in 1860, and then 5 years later they would do another corner, and then they would do another corner, and then another corner. And so that's why there's a bit of a mishmash in different communities, whereas Colonel King, perhaps because he was very educated, had the foresight to think, let's plan out this whole thing. Let's really decide how we want this new community to look. So as he was doing this and getting it surveyed out, Stewart, who owned this property, he was the first one to agree. He agreed before Harrington did. And he had decided that when they're going to name this community, he said we should really name this after someone who built the first house in this community in the woods. There was nothing, but this was just a crossroads. It was all wooded areas. And for someone to have the foresight to actually begin a community and commit to it by building a house, that we should name the community after him. So that's how Kingsville got its name. And we have highlighted in yellow are some of the properties that Colonel King had purchased. Further, not only did he have the vision, not only did he encourage other people, but he actually put his money into it as well. So he purchased these lots right away. And so he really got the community going. So We're going to talk about his house just a bit. We covered this at the last talk, but this is the Colonel King house. So he had the first one that he built in Kingsville on King Street. And in 1859, Colonel King and his wife had this 2-story octagonal brick house, and this was built on Mill Street West. The original house was just the octagonal part. The wings came on later, and we'll talk about that afterwards. I won't get too much into it because I did talk about it last time, but if you remember, anyone who saw or were at my last talk, the interesting thing about this property is the octagonal shape of it, and it was because it was based on phrenology, which is the ancient art of reading the bumps and planes on your head. And so, so based on phrenology and, its, laws of phrenology, this was considered the healthiest building style. And a famous phrenologist actually wrote a whole architecture book about how all buildings should be this style. And it was popular for about 10 years. Luckily, it was around the time that Colonel King was looking to build, and he would have been an educated man. So this phrenologist actually came to Detroit a few times, and he gave talks, and perhaps he perhaps he brought his books with him. And being so close to Detroit, perhaps Colonel King or his wife attended one of these lectures and was converted. But we do have this lovely octagonal house, and it is the only octagonal house in Ontario south of London. There's some north of London, Toronto, and Ottawa area, but we're the only ones here that have one. So it's a really unique house, and it's beautiful. So we're going to be talking about the children of Colonel King. So he did marry Sarah Perry Nightingale in 1826, and she was a military widow. She had 2 sons when she was widowed. She had Leonard Geoffrey Nightingale, born in 1821, and Alexander Ernest Nightingale, born in 1823. And then after she got married to Colonel King, they proceeded to have 4 children between them. We have James, Helena, Alfred, and Sidney. We're going to go through each one of those kids because there's a lot of unique stories amongst them. And even there's a mystery as well. So there is a mystery here that I'm still looking to solve. Now, we're going to go back to England here because Nightingale actually is a baronetcy. So there is a baronet Nightingale still to this day. So it is an ancient family. We have here the coat of arms, and it does say the creation date is the 1st of September, 1628. So the baronetcy has been around for that long. And this was their, county seat. So to tell you, Sarah was actually 15 years old when she married a 25-year-old Leonard Nightingale. So this is Leonard Sr., and he was the 8th of 11 children born to Sir Edward Nightingale. And he was the baronet of the community. This area, Cambridgeshire, is actually east, kind of the east part of England. And to let you know, the baronetcy is a hereditary title below that of a baron, but above that of a knight. So it's kind of right in between there. Leonard was 10 years old when his father died, and his older brother inherited the title. When of age, Leonard served as a lieutenant in the Cambridgeshire militia. And that kind of happened in England, didn't it? Because they had those rules of progenitor, which is everything in the family went down to the oldest son. And because, unlike the French way, which is you would divide your properties amongst all your kids, after a couple generations, everyone's just kind of got a few acres. Whereas England, they wanted to keep everything very within the family and condensed. So, with Leonard being 8th of 11 children, there was no way he was going to inherit. And that usually what happened is a lesser son would end up going into the military, and that's what Leonard did. And he married Sarah Perry in 1819 at the age of 25. So she was 15, he was 25. Again, not unusual for the age. So Leonard's brother, I told you that Leonard's father had died when Leonard was 10 years old. Well, his older brother, who was actually the second, the oldest had died when he was a young boy, was only 20 years old when he inherited the property. And so he inherited it in 1804, and he didn't prove to be much of a successful caretaker of the estate. So by 1925, he was attending insolvent debtors court, and by 1831, the estate was auctioned off. So the mansion had been in the Nightingale family. So the baronetcy had been around, but the actual mansion in that area had been in the Nightingale family for over 200 years. So within 20 years of inheriting it, he lost it. Now, they originally had like the mansion and a little bit of property, and then over those 200 years, each generation kind of added more property and, you know, more to the estate. And so when this auction happened, and this is from 1831, it describes the Neesworth, which is the name of the estate, as having a mansion, park grounds, plantations, several farms together with the manor and manorial rights, and the whole of the village. And he lost it within 20 years. So I bring this up because, well, A, one, it's interesting, but two, I bring this up because Leonard died in March of 1826, and his widow, Sarah, she married James King 9 months later. And I assume that, you know, this was all kind of going on. He was in debtors, going to debtors court, that there wouldn't have been enough Nightingale money to support a young widow and her 2 sons. So she had to look elsewhere. And unfortunately, I haven't been able to find much out about Sarah herself. So I don't know what her family situation was. So, you know, it wouldn't have been uncommon for just have to get married again in order to support yourself and your 2 sons. So, now it's interesting, just fast forward a little bit, so one of the sons, Ernest, it is interesting to note that in Ernest's obituary in 1904, it actually makes a special mention about him being a grandson of the late Sir Edward Nightingale, Neesworth Hall, Cambridgeshire, England. So even though, you know, his uncle had lost it, he still, you know, was enough that he remembered his legacy, and he wanted to make sure that people knew that he was part of the Nightingale family. And as I said, that the baronetcy is still around today, and you can look it up and see who's the present baronet. So unfortunately, I don't have any photos of the Nightingale boys, but here, again, we're going to review that we have Leonard Geoffrey Nightingale. He was known as Leonard, and Alexander Ernest Nightingale was called Ernest most of the time. Now, the oldest son, which is Leonard, you know, both boys came with Colonel King and their mom here, and they were raised in the family, just like normal. And at the age of 16, while they were here, Leonard did enlist with the militia during the Upper Canada Rebellion of 1837 and 1838. And that's specifically interesting in this area because we actually have what's known as the Battle of Pelee Island, which was part of the rebellion. So I'm going to read this off to you to give you a little information about what happened. So this is the Battle of Pelee Island, and it says on this historical marker that's on Pelee Island, on February 26, 1838, a group of over 300 American supporters of William Lyon Mackenzie's rebellion, led by Major Lester Hoadley, captured this island. So they captured Pelee Island. In response, Colonel John Maitland, commanding the Western District, which is what this area was referred to, before it was Essex County, it was the Western District, dispatched 5 infantry companies supported by militia and Indians across the ice from Amherstburg. On March 3rd, fleeing a southward sweep by the main force, the Americans were intercepted offshore from here by a detachment of 126 men led by Captain George Brown. Brown's force lost 5, the enemy's at least 11 killed, including its leader, and 11 were taken prisoner. Following closely the defeat of the rebel supporters on Fighting Island, so downriver a little bit, on February 25th, this victory marked the second time in 1 week that a force invading Canadian territory had been repulsed. So that's some local history about this. Leonard was part of the militia. I don't know if he was on active service, but he was he might have even stayed on shore. But we do know that James King fought at the Battle of Pelee Island as a lieutenant in the militia. And after the militia was decommissioned, because the militia was only struck up when it was needed, so after it was decommissioned, King was promoted to lieutenant colonel, and that's how he became Colonel King. And I always think it's very interesting to note that when he referred to himself or any documents that he wrote, Colonel King never referred to himself as Colonel King. Everyone else called him Colonel King, but that wasn't something that he referred to himself as. So Leonard, after being in the militia, as an adult, he ran a general store here in Kingsville, was involved in lumbering. He ran a tannery on Pearl Street West and was auditor for Essex County Council. So obviously, having his dad being a school teacher, he was well schooled. So he was an accountant, an auditor. And then later he moved to the States as a traveling salesman. He married Lucinda Harrington, and they had a son and daughter together. And he ended up dying early in 1885 in Detroit. So he's a traveling salesman. So we go on to the next brother, which is Ernest Nightingale. So like his brother, Ernest had many business interests, including a tannery with his brother Leonard, and then taking over his half-brother's general store. So his brother James Jr. ran the store where the CIBC Bank is now at the Four Corners. That's where the King store was. And then he took over the store from his brother. Then he went into commercial traveling and was even bailiff from 1850 to 1854. So it seemed, they had a lot of things happening, and you'll see that with a lot of the King children. They just seemed to have a lot of gumption, and they just had a lot of, irons in the fire. So he led a quiet life, not marrying until he was 46. And at this point, he decided to settle down in Kingsville and start farming. So he actually married his brother Leonard's wife's half-sister, Polly Harrington Stewart. So remember I told you that, the Four Corners, the Kingsville had the Stewart farm and the Harrington farm? Well, this was Polly Stewart, the daughter. She ended up marrying a Harrington from the other side of the street. And then she was widowed, and she ended up marrying Colonel King's stepson. Now, the interesting thing about this, too, is that Polly, from her first marriage, had two daughters, and one of whom was married to a government, and his actual title was Indian agent. So the daughter was married to an Indian agent for the Canadian government, and he was the Indian agent in Saskatchewan during the Louis Riel Rebellion in 1885. And in fact, Minnie, who was the daughter, was with her husband in Saskatchewan when the rebellion was starting up, and she escaped the day before the community was overrun. She came to Kingsville to stay with her mom and stepdad, and she stayed with Ernest and Polly and continued to live with them even after the husband who survived came back and joined them here. Now, later, if we have time, I have a very interesting newspaper interview with Minnie just a couple weeks after she escaped the rebellion. She was traveling with some friends back to this area and stopped in Detroit for a couple days with friends. And the Detroit News had heard that she was in town, and they interviewed her. So I have actually from 1885 the interview with her. So it's quite an interesting story. So if we have time afterwards, if you guys are interested, I'll read it to you. So we're now going to go to James and Sarah's oldest child. So this is James Jr. And he was born in 1835, and then this is his wife, Harriet. So James Jr. attended high school in Ohio because, back he would have been like 55, we wouldn't have had a high school here. So you would have had to probably go to Chatham, maybe Windsor to go to high school. So this family elected to go to Ohio to go to high school. And because it was easy, because we had steamer ships that would go over there. It was a short commute. And so he stayed there for a few years, and he learned the trade of bookkeeping. And there he met and married Harriet, and then they settled in Kingsville afterwards, and he stayed here the whole time. And he led a quiet life. He was an insurance agent, and he was a bookkeeper for many business enterprises. And his younger brother, that we'll get into, Sidney, was into a lot of different businesses, and so he would kind of help out his brother with the accounting and some of the secretarial work. James and Harriet had one son, James III, and four daughters. James III ended up marrying and moving out west, and he never had any children. So the King name through that line had died off through that line. So something that was left behind by James Jr. was this beautiful house. So this is the house that they had built on Division Street South, and they built in 1882. And so here we have James in the middle, and there is his mother-in-law and three of his daughters, a friend, and they had a live-in gardener. So they actually had the gardener in the picture with them as well. So we're lucky that this is a legacy left by James Jr. The house is still standing. In the 1940s, the house, when it left the King family, was actually a funeral home in the 1940s here for Kingsville. And now presently, that's what it looks like, and it is a bakery. So it's 86 Division Street South. So we still have this house. Because we're going to be talking about some of the King family houses that are in town. Okay, so next we're going to talk about James and Sarah King's second child, and this was a daughter, Helena. Now, unfortunately, this is the best picture I have of her, and I'm not 100% sure it's her. She's standing next to her husband, so I'm thinking, okay, I'd love to get another picture of her, but I do not have one. So she was Helena Ada King, born in 1837, and Helena and Edward married in 1867, and this is her husband, Dr. Edward Allworth. And they had 2 daughters and 5 sons. And in 1886, Allworth, practicing doctor, he actually was practicing with Helena's brother, Sidney, that we'll get into. He retired from his practice and he became the collector of customs and clerk of the division court. Those were both positions previously held by Colonel King. So, he retired. Colonel King had died, early in the 80s, and so he had kind of taken over his father-in-law's responsibilities, civic responsibilities. So their house is still standing, and this is what it looked like. I'm not sure about the age of this photo, but the house itself was built in 1872, and this is on Pearl Street West. So this is one of Allworth's, I think Helena's up in the corner, but again, not a great picture, and I'm not 100% it's her. But that's one of, I think it's Alfred or something, but that's one of the sons that's standing in front of it. Now, the house is still standing. However, it hasn't fared very well. This is what it looks like now. Yes, this is what it looks like today, and I'll show you a side-by-side comparison. So yeah, it's a bit of a shame, but at least we have this house to remember what it used to look like. So next we're going to go on to James and Sarah King's third child, and this is where I have a mystery, because he was born in 1840, and no one knows when he passed away. No one knows how it ended, not even his direct relatives, because I've been in contact with his direct relatives out in Oregon, and they were the ones that gave me the photo and some other information about the mother, but they don't even know when or where he passed away. So to give you an idea a little bit about Arthur, so in the 1860s, he conducted a livery stable on the north side of Main Street East. So he was dealing with horses, and especially it was next to a hotel here. And so he would also be swapping out horses for travelers as well. And so he'd be, working with horses there. He did that in the 1860s until it was destroyed by fire in 1879. And then he was involved in a variety of commercial endeavors during the 1880s. Get a load of this. So, including the commercial endeavors included a cheese factory in Cottam, a factory for the manufacturing of Hanlon washing machines in Ohio, building and operating a roller rink in Tillsonburg, and running a flour mill with David Conklin, and then later his own sawmill. So he's into a lot of different things. So in 1871, Alfred married Maria Hurlburt, whom he met while she stayed in Kingsville visiting her sister, the wife of the local minister, Minister Ezra Stafford. He was with the Methodist Church. That's how he met her. And so they got married, and together they had 3 children, Sarah, Alfred, and Isabella. And between the years of 1884 and 1891, the Kings lived in no fewer than 6 different locations. So, and not for like losing houses or anything, just I wanderlust or something, because he was into a lot of different things, and they were just moving all over the place. And so Maria took a teaching position in Kingsville in 1893. I think she was saving up money, because in 1897, she traveled with the children to visit her family in Minnesota, and eventually settling in Washington State, and she never came back. So maybe she got tired of the moving, or whatever reason. So, or just all the different businesses being involved with or anything. So she stayed out there with the 3 kids, and it's in fact the descendants of those kids that I was corresponding with. And they actually reached out to me saying, do you know what happened to our great-grandfather? And I said, no, I thought you would know. So I haven't been able to identify the year Alfred died. The last reference I have, so it's not like he disappeared the same time his wife did. He still was in the area. The last reference I have is in his brother James's obituary in 1914, and it said that the brother Alfred was living in Florida. So last known whereabouts was 1914 in Florida. So, it's one of those things every once in a while I kind of, go onto Ancestry or I try to pick something up to see if I can locate him. A lot of times he just went by his initials, A.L. King. There's a lot of those. Sometimes if you're looking up Alfred King, you get a lot of references to King Alfred. So that doesn't help either. So it's, I don't know how long it's going to take for me to solve that mystery. Like I said, I had reached out to, the family out west had reached out to me, and they even have more photos of him. So we have him as a younger boy, or younger man rather. The picture from before, and then this is a photo. I think it might have been on Pearl Street, because at one point he did live next to his sister on Pearl Street, but only for like a year, then he moved. Go figure. So I have these wonderful photos, and I have photos of the kids and I don't know if I have a picture of the wife, but no idea where or when he died. So that's the great mystery that I have to continue on. So now we're getting to Sarah and James King's fourth child. This is the youngest child. This is Sidney Arthur King, born in 1844. So notice the date 1844, because if you remember back, I had talked about the King's first home in Kingsville was built in 1843 on King Street. And so it's commonly, and this goes way back to when he was still alive, he was often referred to as the first white child born in Kingsville. So that was a moniker that stayed with him for many, many years. And so he was born in 1844. And like his older brother, he went to high school in Ohio, specifically Port Clinton. And then he went on to attend Victoria School of Medicine in Cobourg, Ontario. And he graduated in 3 years, because that's like medical school was, I guess, 3 years back then. He graduated in 1867. Now, continuing with his father's military service, Sidney organized and commanded a company of volunteers during the Fenian Raid in June 1866. And just to refresh your memories, because I know you guys all know about the Fenian Raids, I'm going to talk to you about this. This is from the Canadian Encyclopedia, but to sum it up, the Fenians were a secret society of Irish patriots who had emigrated from Ireland to the United States. Some members of this movement tried to take Canadian territory by force so they could exchange it with Britain for Irish independence. And from 1866 to 1871, the Fenians launched several small armed attacks. Each raid was put down by the government forces, and one of them did happen here. And like I said, Dr. Sidney King, he ended up rallying some troops. And a little bit more about his military service. So after the Fenian raids, Dr. King continued his military service with the D Squadron of the 1st Hussars. During the yearly exercises in London in the summer, so just before I get to that part, so this is the 1st Hussars are still here. They're more out of Sarnia and London, but they were active from 1856 to present. And they were line cavalry and armored cavalry. So after he didn't retire, he continued on with the Hussars, and during yearly exercises in London in the summer of 1897, Dr. King was promoted to District Staff Surgeon for the whole unit. And then 5 years later, he received his Long Service Medal with the inscription, presented to Surgeon Major and Honorable Sergeant Lieutenant Colonel S.A. King, 1st Hussars. So in fact, Dr. King was also a colonel as well, although he never used that moniker, but he was also a colonel. So we have a legacy from Dr. King with his first house, which is still standing, and it is near the King Estate on Mill Street West. And this is the house that Sidney and his wife, Esther, built in 1878. 28-year-old Dr. King He married Esther in 1872, so a few years before they built this house, who was the daughter of Solomon Weigel, who was a prominent figure in Essex in the early days and a member of the first provincial legislature. He represented this area in the first provincial legislature. So the Kings had this home on Mill Street West built in 1873. Together they had 3 sons and 2 daughters, but sadly Esther died in 1881. Sidney never remarried, and unfortunately I don't have a picture of Esther either, or a painting or anything like that. So, you know, perhaps there's one out there somewhere. But this house is still standing. But after Colonel King's death in 1880, and a year before Esther died, Sidney and Esther inherited the King homestead. And actually, before Colonel King died, he did kind of divvy up all his different properties and everything, and he divided them equally amongst all the kids. And it just so happens that Sidney was the one that got this house and the property on Mill Street. It was Sidney himself that added the 2 wings to the octagonal home shortly after Esther's death in 1881. So Dr. King was a pretty impressive guy. No Hanlon washing machines, but we have, in 1887, he became the reeve of the village of Kingsville by acclamation. So the first time he became reeve, he didn't even have to run. And he was acclaimed each year, and he would hold that office until retiring from local politics in 1894. So he was the reeve. He practiced medicine in Kingsville actively until 1893, when he withdrew from his profession in order to give his undivided attention to his increasing building interests. So, and his building interests were extensive. In May 1876, Dr. King had the first issue of the Kingsville Reporter newspaper issued. So he was the original publisher of the Kingsville Reporter, which sadly is no longer being issued. In the spring of 1884, Dr. King partnered with James Smart to purchase a portion of John Harrington's farm on the east side of Division Street South and had it subdivided into lots. So not unlike his father, who had the 4 corners done, Dr. King had the east side. And those building lots created new streets. So the streets we're talking about are Maple Street, Myrtle Street, Prospect, Erie, Park Street, and Lansdowne Avenue were all surveyed under the orders of Dr. King and his partner, Mr. Smart. Then in January 1889, natural gas was discovered in Gosfield South, and Dr. King was an early supporter. He became the president of the Kingsville Natural Gas and Oil Company, and when the Ontario Natural Gas Company was formed the next year, Hiram Walker was the president and Dr. King was the vice president. And Hiram Walker of Walkerville fame, and also was the whiskey magnate, and he was into a lot of things, including natural gas. And also, between the years of 1891 and 1900, Hiram Walker had built the railroad that came from Walkerville and came through to Kingsville. So between 1891 and 1900, Dr. King was vice president of the Lake Erie and Detroit River Railroad, also known as Hiram Walker's Railroad, and president from 1901 until 1902, when that railroad was actually sold to the Père Marquette Railway. And that was after Hiram Walker had died. Hiram Walker's sons divested a lot of these interests, even in the Kingsville area, and so they had sold the railway to the Père Marquette. In 1903, Dr. King and 4 of his children planned out an addition to Green Hill Cemetery on land that his wife Esther had inherited from her father, Solomon Weigel. The original cemetery, we're talking Green Hill, was laid out by Weigel in 1879. So 1879 was the first time that there was actually a proper cemetery. Up until then, people just kind of buried people on different areas of their farms themselves, like a back corner of their farm would be there. We do have a smaller cemetery here across on Pearl Street, across that are the oldest ones, but some people had been reinterred from the farms and reburied into that smaller one. So, but Green Hill Cemetery was Solomon Weigel's. He left it to his wife. Dr. King inherited it from his wife when she passed, and then so it was interesting that it was a private cemetery. So there's actually deeds. You can go to the archives and you can find deeds written out from Dr. King and the kids, giving you a deed to the cemetery plot, and they were registered with the land registry. So it was very important here in this community to have this cemetery. Dr. King died on July 8th, 1907, at the age of only 63. Now, at the time of his death, In addition to his interests in gas and oil and the railroad, Dr. King was also president of the Iron Brown Paint Company of Detroit, president of the McCloskey Fence Company, president of Kingsville Woolen Mills, vice president of the Western Peat Fuel Company, president of Girardeau Wine Company, director of the Essex Loan and Savings Company, director of the Empire Accident and Surety Company, vice president of Wheeler Steamship Company, New York, and president of the Manitoulin Lumber Company, all before the age of 63. Incredible, and being a doctor as well. So as reported in 1907, after his death, application has been made in the circuit court to probate the will of the late Dr. S.A. King. The inventory, which accompanies the application, places the value of the estate at $187,000. Of this amount, $149,000 is in stocks in different companies, and the remainder in real estate or cash. And according to the terms of the will, the estate is to be divided equally among his children. Esther and Sidney had 6 children, but by the time of his death, there was only 4 children remaining. Interesting, the amount the government will receive in succession duties is 5%, at 5%, which is more than $9,000. So that's what would have been the succession duties at the time. Now, I want to close off about the children of Colonel King with a couple snippets from the Amherstburg Echo newspaper about Dr. King. And keep in mind, this wasn't even the newspaper he owned, but it just kind of shows you how beloved he was by the community, because there was lots of comments about him, and there's a couple funny ones here that I like. So this is from March 1888. Dr. S.A. King was suddenly called to Pelee Island on Monday evening of last week. The bad state of the ice after the rain made the crossing quite dangerous, and it requires more nerve than ordinary doctors possess to cross Lake Erie at this time of year. But more is expected of the doctor than most men. As with his other accomplishments, he is a soldier and would cross Lake Erie on a cake of ice 10 feet square if duty called, with nothing but his medical reputation for a paddle. And then in 1891, this mentioned, our Reeve, Dr. King, has had another birthday on Friday, January 23rd. He became 47 years old to a minute. One enthusiastic citizen hoisted his country's flag in honor of the event, to the surprise of many. Grenville remarked that any man who could stand the strain of municipal office and get away with a half bushel of railway passes should still stay single and keep as good looking as Kingsville's Reeve should. And he should keep his flag at full mast at all time. Is that a euphemism? And then finally, from his obituary that was printed in the Kingsville Reporter, in part, to our readers, to most of whom he was so well known, what can we say? What need we say in eulogy of the deceased? Of him, it can be truly said, he bore the white flower of a blameless life, the soul of honor, the tongue of truth, of a lovable and loving disposition. He had a multitude of warm friends and no enemies. Although severed from Kingsville in a business way for the past decade, it was always home to him. It was where he lived, and it was here he died. And his death leaves a gap here that never can be filled. So that's quite a eulogy for Dr. King, and shows you how important he was to this community. So that is the children of Colonel King and Sarah. Now, would anyone like to hear the story about the rebellion? Sure. I'll read it fast. So this, as I said, was published in the Detroit Free Press and before I start that, I do want to say, now this was taken from the Library and Archives Canada. So certain parts of this presentation, specifically this, contains historical language and content that may be considered offensive or potentially harmful, such as language used to refer to racial, ethnic, or cultural groups. So the content and descriptions reflect the period in which they were created and the views of their creators. We retain these references with their original descriptions to ensure that attitudes and perspectives are not erased from the historical record. So there's some problematic language in this telling of this story, and I just wanted to acknowledge, it doesn't make me happy to say them, but I'm going to read what was actually written back in 1885. So the title was From Battleford, a Lady Refugee of Rael's Rebellion. So again, this is Minnie. This was Ernest Nightingale's step-daughter, and she married J.M. Ray, and so he was the Indian agent. And so she came here and she was being interviewed by Detroit Free Press. So, quote, about 2 weeks ago, the people of Battleford, so this is Saskatchewan, began to hear unpleasant stories that the Cree Indians, who reservation adjourned Battleford, were going to rise in support of Rael's half-breeds, who had been making quite a deal of trouble about Prince Albert and Duck Lake. A week ago last Sunday, the English residents of the town and most of the loyal persons of whatever nationality crossed the river and entered the barracks, which is where she was stationed with her husband. There was, however, a company, including a number of ladies, which, for safety, started at once to go overland to the terminus of the Canadian Pacific Railway, a distance of 180 miles. I was in this party. We left at 6 o'clock Sunday evening upon our long wagon journey. It was 10 o'clock the following morning that the Indians took the town and destroyed everything not carried inside the barracks. The fort has since been under siege by the Indians. Our wagons made about 40 miles the first day, and we camped the first night on the Stoney Indian Reserve. The Stonies were supposed to be loyal to the government, particularly as they had been long at feud with the Crees. One of the most remarkable things of our escape from the country was the experience of this night. We noticed that when we arrived at the Stoney Reservation that the Indians wore their war paint and that there was a great deal of excitement among them. But Mr. Payne, an Englishman who lived on the reservation and was married to the daughter of the principal chief, told us that the Indians were simply preparing to defend themselves in case Rael's followers should attempt to carry away any of their horses. There was a great deal of excitement all through the night, and the driver of my wagon, an Indian named John Daniels, long in my husband's employ, had a number of animated discussions with the Indians, but we did not know what it pertained to. Our little caravan pulled out of town the next morning. That very forenoon, the Stoney Indians rose and murdered Payne, among others. Then they joined in surrounding the barracks at Battleford. We could not understand how we came to be spared, and I cannot tell yet. Some of our party think we were saved purely by the influence of Daniels, my driver. It was evidently booty they were after, and I cannot see why they left our horses and our luggage pass. We drove early and late and camped out 4 times, but we were 7 days in passing from Battleford to Swift Current, the present terminus of the Canadian Pacific Railroad. At the crossing of the Saskatchewan, we came upon 2 mounted police who told us of the uprising at Battleford and the massacre thereabouts, which made us hasten our movements. Our stock provisions ran out, and we had been 24 hours without food, with the prospect of fasting until we reached Swift Current, when we fortunately met a gentleman who was driving towards Battleford with a wagon load of various kinds of provisions. He not only opened his supplies for our needs, but he turned about with us and made for Swift Current. The journey was a terribly hard one and was accompanied with great discomfort. The last 140 miles, there is nothing but an open rolling plain, and the snow and mud made the trails terrible. The mud would become fastened to the wheels a foot thick and had to be chopped off. At Swift Current, we took a Canadian Pacific train. On the train, I saw a paper that had a dispatch relating the fact that my husband had been massacred. But at Winnipeg, I learned by private telegrams that this was incorrect and that he was still safe in the barracks at Battleford. Coming down, we passed a company of the Queen's Own going up the railway. They have since had a dreadful time advancing on to Saskatchewan, suffering from frozen feet and hands. From the reporter, how much of the town is Battleford? Quote, there is nothing of it now, I suppose. It was a crude village containing the government buildings and a few stores. It was considered, after Prince Albert, the most important in the Saskatchewan country. Reporter, the Indians have made common use with the half-breeds? Answer, certainly, they have been contemplating their rising all winter. Question, have any Indians remained loyal? Answer, very, very few. There was an industrial school for young Indians at Battleford, and every one of the 30 students joined the rebels. I think my driver was one of the loyal ones, and we were warned to leave Battleford by the brother of a chief who told us he would stay and fight for us to the last, but it would do no good. A number of Indians went into the barracks at Battleford with the others, but some of them have been discovered to be spies of Rael's. Question, how large was your party? Answer, it consisted of Judge Rouleau, the Battleford magistrate, his wife and children, Mrs. Dr. Rouleau and her children, Mr. Bethune, Inspector of Government Buildings, and myself. In addition, there were our drivers and servants. Question, where did they remain? Answer, Judge Rouleau stopped in Regina, others came to Winnipeg. I am the only one that came into the States. Question, when do you expect to return? Not until the country becomes settled and not directly then. Of course, it will take some time to rebuild the buildings at Battleford, and I cannot go until we get a house to live in. I shall soon go to my house in Kingsville, where I shall remain until the insurrection is over, probably. And that's when she went to go live with Ernest Nightingale and her mother, Polly. So that concludes the presentation.